Excellent. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Nelson. I'm the VP of Marketing and Business Development at Valora Technologies, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, and Happy New Year, because it is the first one of 2022. Today, we're going to be discussing the recently written white paper, Top 10 Reasons IG Projects Fail. Leading practices, lessons learned, and tips to keep your project on track. And our format today is going to be an open discussion with the authors and panelists. And we encourage you to ask questions as we go along. In the little comments, you put your comments in. You may agree, you may disagree with the top 10, and we'd love to hear your feedback there too. So please enter that into the Zoom chat. Now, the webinar is based on the contents of this white paper, but you don't have to have read it it's not a prerequisite to attend. But if you haven't read it, you can head to the website at valoratech.com. And on the homepage under What's New, you can click that and it will take you to the white paper. You can view it, you can download it as a PDF, or you can view it as a flipbook. So there's options there. And I will also send out a link to it after the recording. So we're good there. So let's meet our authors and our panelists of this white paper. So first, no stranger to our Valora webinar series is Sandy Serkes, who is our founder and CEO at Valora Technologies. We also have Derk joining us, who is the Managing Director of Information Governance and Legal Operations at Ernst & Young. Welcome, Eric. And we also have Higgins joining us, who runs Information Governance and Privacy at Ernst & Young. So welcome to everyone. Our expert panelists bring each of them. Now, I read in the white paper that somebody had said, like, together you've almost got a century of experience, but I'm not going to date anybody, but you all have over 20 years experience in information governance and e-discovery, records management, implementation, risk management. So welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you so much for joining us, because I know this is going to be a pretty awesome discussion. So as an introduction, so the foreword of this white paper was actually written by Jason Barron, who is an IG and e-discovery expert, certainly by his own right. He's currently serving as the professor of the practice at the University of Maryland College of Information Studies, and he has quite a notable career in IG and e-discovery. And in his foreword, he refers to IG practitioners as agents of change, and encourages us all to think strategically and holistically about how organizations can implement and accomplish enterprise-wide IG. And of this white paper, he says, the questions posed by the expert authors in this ebook are exactly the right ones to ask. And he goes on to say that this ebook represents IG evangelism at its best. Every future IG champion will benefit from absorbing its lessons. So if that's not an intro, I don't know what is. So let's jump in. So top 10 reasons IG projects fail. So why, dear panelists, why this subject, this topic, and also importantly, why now? Eric.
Well, I can go first. I think, you know, when I've been in the data management, information governance, discovery space since about 1998. That's why I have gray hair. But I think we are still in a first generation of a lot of the practices. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that there's a great book called My Life is Failure. It's a project management book. But it talks a lot about the human dynamic and how humans learn more from their failures than they do from their successes. So I was just kind of talking to Sandy about Sandy and I were just kind of talking about some of the projects that we've done. And most of the times when we talk, even with Caroline and I, we talk about things that we could have done differently. What are the lessons learned, after action kind of things. So we kind of just agreed that it would be great to put together a kind of a viewpoint on why these projects don't always kind of have the expected outcomes. You might have a great design, but the expected outcome isn't always realized. And so that's kind of the impetus behind why we wrote this. And I think this is probably something that will take another second or third generation down the path as we continue to evolve in the practice. But Sandy, I didn't know if you had anything to add to that.
I will add to that, and it's really on the why now question. And I think, you know, if you ask certainly any IG practitioner, any records manager, you know, are these good ideas? Of course they're good ideas. They've been good ideas for a decade. But what's been missing is the impetus. Let's get going. Let's do it now. And one of the silver linings of the whole pandemic is the now factor, because we're all operating remotely. I'll bet almost nobody on this phone call is even in an office anymore. And the systems that we have built that got us kind of up to the pandemic really don't cut it anymore. And so everyone and everything is in this rush to automate and get things under control. So it really is kind of IG's moment now to shine. So what a great time to put it out there and say, you're finally ready. Fantastic. Don't make these mistakes.
Yeah, excellent. Caroline, anything to add there?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. By way of quick introduction, I've been doing records management and information governance for 25-ish years now, and I've known Sandy and Eric for a long time. So, and Jennifer, thank you so much for bringing us all together. I think one of the reasons that this really spoke to me as a topic at the moment, the why now piece, is that it's not just why now, but this has been building up for a little while, and I have always had this frustration. So I come at this from a pretty pure records management background. I have very much an academic understanding of records management, but I've been working with people in the records management space for a long time now, and I alone do not share, I believe, this frustration that records management in organizations for a long time has been seen as this necessary evil. It's a cost. There's no return on investment for it. And that has changed. And that's something that we talk about in the white paper, and we'll talk a little bit more about it today. But records management is a critical component of information governance and all of the things that it spans. And information governance, Sandy, you were talking about how this is a good time for us to be moving forward. But so I think that if we start thinking about this in terms of how records management is just one component of IG, InfoGov, we can really start having the necessary conversations with leadership to help them understand that information governance is a backbone to treating your information and data as assets. And that's what we have to do in the face of digital transformation.
Cool. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's get into the actual top 10 reasons that IG projects fail, and the ones that are highlighted in the white paper. So I'm not sure if these were actually done in any particular order. Authors, were they? It was kind of like, So let's look at them before we dive in. Okay, number one, lack of leadership, lack of operating structure, limited vision, insufficient communication, policy abandonment, information in the shadows, content fracturing, rusty and inadequate technology tools, custody of business data sits with IT, and poorly managed processes. So these were identified as the top 10 reasons IG projects fail. It's not all doom and gloom, because you also offer in the white paper strategies and ideas on how to get yourselves out of there and how to make sure it's a success. So when you look at these top 10, we kind of looked at them, found that they kind of grouped into 3 buckets. So these kind of 4 fit in strategy, these kind of fall under structure, and then the last 3 here kind of fall under enablement. So that's how we're going to structure the discussion today. And let's start with strategy. So Eric, maybe we'll start with you. So, what are some of the issues or the points that are highlighted here? And, what makes it so important to get, as an example, executive sponsorship in an IG program?
Yeah, John just posted in the comments that number one is number one. I couldn't agree more. In fact, Caroline and I were on a call just this morning with a client who is struggling to consolidate a series of, whether it's on-prem or online file shares. And the business thinks that there's a need, but the leadership is like, meh, not really that big of a deal. What the leadership in that company is continuing to fail to understand, they're not regulated, is that they are kind of fragmenting all of these solutions and creating more and more risk over time. So the fact that a lot of leadership continues to see this as, like as Caroline is saying, is kind of a perfunctory, got to do it. You have to have a schedule and you have a policy, so you write it down, so you have to comply. That is very antiquated in the way that people should be thinking about it. Now, there's plenty of companies that are being forced to have leadership around these new ideas or these kind of evolving ideas, mostly because of things like the DFS, the GDPR, the CCPA. There's regulations that are saying you need to have playbooks, but you need to get rid of things that are no longer material to your business. So those kind of regulations are starting to get people to say, we better do a better job of managing our data. So the main idea around leadership is that I think there's one other thought about lack of leadership and why it's so is a lot of leaders come from specific areas of a business, right? They'll have an allegiance to a sales team or a marketing team or a development team or a tech team. And they don't necessarily have, they don't always have the integrated vision on how all of these teams need to use information to really be more competitive, make money, maybe stay out of hot water. So when you have a leader that brings forward this vision on integration, it typically works. But it can't just be kind of, it can't be something that, like Caroline's saying, it's not something that is something that you see as an obligatory thing and you can just set it aside. There's very few people that we work with on the leadership front that see the imperative here, IG as an imperative. But I do think that's changing, not just because of regulations, but because of data bloat. And you see what's happened with clients like JPMC in the press this week, where they got sanctioned by the SEC for $200 million for not retaining things like WhatsApp, not retaining Signal. So they've got broker dealers and traders that are out there doing stuff, and I think a lot of it's due to COVID. I think they're doing stuff in a new way of working because they have to be more agile and kind of quick to market. And so they're doing what they need to do in a time that maybe IT enterprise applications can't service. So again, we really have to push ourselves to think differently about how IG can help us be more competitive, how it can help us, maybe improve margin or make more money. And that's really a leadership challenge. I guess the other thing that you move into number 2, where the operating structure. This really means the model. Again, Caroline and I work with a client today that has a very bifurcated model, and when I say model, I mean like the operating way in which this IG program comes forward. And the example is, you might have a team that's called information governance, but then on another team, maybe in your IT management, you have a team called data management or data governance. And so you have a lot of different coats of paint on the same framework of work being done. And that's problematic. So it's problematic, and it's driven by ego, it's driven by territory, it's driven by people who might be thinking that they have a better vision of what you may have. But all of that's it's silly. At the end of the day, the fundamental principles of what we're really trying to achieve are understand what you have, understand how you might need to action it based on some policy, retention schedule, some compliance routine, and understand how to get rid of it, retain or get rid of it in a defensible way. And a lot of clients don't lack that kind of integrated thinking around how all these different departments need to kind of perform around the same fundamental principles. But that's such a big idea. I mean, Sandy, I didn't know, or Caroline, I didn't know if you guys had any thoughts about the model or the operating structure.
Yeah, I'll add something there. I think what we often see is there's a group that's kind of oriented around risk control and risk mitigation. Their legal, their records, their IG, even security would fit in that bucket, trying to protect the organization and therefore have to know kind of what the content is about. But then we have kind of totally disconnected, often IT that just thinks data is data, data is data. So they're not really appreciating the nuance of, no, this data is really important, this data is less important. They're just kind of all things data all the time. And so their solutions tend to be too simplistic. And then the other kind of like out in left field group are the business units, the departments that are just trying to get their job done and really don't want to have to take on this burden, this structure of having to figure out what they have and how it might be needed, and coming up with tags. It's just too overwhelming for them. So you have this really disjointed universe of people who aren't communicating and don't appreciate why this is happening. It either just feels like some stupid thing that I'm going to try and ignore as long as I can, or something I can just kind of fake. Mm-hmm. And all of that sets up ultimately for a failure, because of course you're not going to succeed in that situation.
Yeah. To me, it comes back to this idea about when you have similar ideas, like retention's a good idea. It's a good example. You need to retain stuff for specific, whether it's a business purpose or compliance or regulatory purpose. And how do you do that? Well, many people just put out a policy that says for these specific types of records and information, we need to keep it for this long. Or as Sandy's saying, this information might, as Iron Mountain would say, this information is more vital. So it's more lifebloodish. So we want to keep that and protect it over here. And a good example of that is the books and records of how FINRA and SEC prescribe retention. The SEC and FINRA don't have like a causal approach to how an entity is supposed to retain all records, but books and records are more important, right? To them anyway. So when a bank or a broker dealer or a carrier comes in and says, these are our more important records, well, typically they'll have an archive, and that archive will store those records. But what happens to the rest of the stuff? And I think that's where I think a lot of people get lost, because they might think that they have a standard routine or a practice in place around records management, but it's really sometimes very slim and narrow. And a lot of times you still, even after all of that, all the policy creation, all the tech setup, you still don't have an affirmative disposition. So you do all this work, right? Where you set these kind of retention silos up, but then the majority of clients that I know, and I work in banking, financial services, and in the carrier space, and some in life sciences, very few actually get rid of stuff. Very few have a routine that's automated or semi-automated to say, you've got these X amount of records that are eligible for disposition. Do you want to flow through a legal hold trap or a compliance trap and get rid of them? Very few companies do that. But again, as I said before, I think the obligations from the regulators are now emerging to say, you can't keep that anymore. And by the way, we've also this thing called insider risk or insider threat, and you've got rogues that are copying stuff, and so there's a lot of other kind of attack points that if you don't have good policy that's followed by good practice, eventually you're just going to you're going to find yourself in some hot water. So Caroline, I know you're kind of passionate about this kind of stuff. What are your thoughts?
So I'm kind of thinking about this so there's an easy topic, and then there's a more difficult topic in the sense that one's easier to tackle than the other, and the sort of lack of operating structure isn't just about making sure that you've got professionals on hand who know how to do this. I'm guessing that that almost everyone on this call is a professional in some form or fashion, either within or relating to the IG space. And so you all will get it when we talk about how the operating structure also includes the people in the business, and how if you haven't sort of in a predetermined fashion defined what the roles and responsibilities are going to be relating to IG with people in the business, the process changes that are necessary in order to implement simply don't happen. And even if you have an academically sound idea of what you're going to do, and of course that's tied to communication as well in terms of making sure people know what their responsibilities are. But so I'll sum that up because I know we have a limited time today. But so we've encapsulated these 4 topics within the category of strategy. So let's talk about strategy for a moment. It's not listed as one of the 4, but when we're talking about organizational strategy and strategic planning at like the board of directors level and the C-suite, they get to often, what my experience is that they are often so focused on progress for the organization and moving forward, and the bottom line that sometimes things like information governance get lost in the shuffle, like, or things will become popular and sexy for the moment, like cybersecurity in the 20 teens was something that was on the roster of topics at every board of directors meeting, right? And so we should have been there having conversations with them about the relationship between information governance and how getting rid of content means you are reducing your risk level because you don't have to protect it any longer. And so let's build those connections across the various components of information governance so that IG becomes part of the corporate near-term and long-term strategy. Data and information are an asset. In some companies now, that's their only asset, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Uber or Airbnb, for example.
Yeah.
Pick up on that, Carolyn. The buzzword this year and probably the next couple of years is all going to be about automation and moving to a fully automated, everything is, kind of handled with AI and whatnot. What the opportunity for us all to seize right now is that information governance is the path to that. The more and more we become information-oriented organizations, the more that is the actual path to fully automating business processes. So you might as well start with understanding what the heck you have if you think you're going to be automating control and manipulation of that.
Yeah, and what you have and what you have that's actually, maybe more relevant or more pertinent to a specific routine. One of the things that so when strategy is kind of a big word, right? It's hard to understand how to implement an IG strategy because you're dealing with lots of different disciplines. You might be dealing with a lot of different stakeholders. You might be dealing with different jurisdictional requirements and regulations. So sometimes you have a lot of kind of different fragmentation around developing a cohesive strategy. But in every organization is different in this approach. But what I'm going to say is, but think about tangible things that you can build arguments around that can advocate for a program and a real strategy. So a good example of this is the outcome of a litigation or the outcome of an investigation. And you can start looking at trends and patterns in what happens when you fight or flee, or when you have inside, teams or rogues that are doing bad things. And typically speaking, the second and third lines of defense will take that information and they'll go back to a learning and development team and say, we got to make sure that nobody's doing insider like fantasy football, communication on our messaging platforms. Okay, well that's certainly a good outcome. But you think about what lawyers and what compliance people go through every day, and a lot of times what the business and the C-suite will say is, well, just fix it. It's not just the days of just fixing things have to go away. We have to introduce Kaizen, and we have to introduce thoughts of continuous improvement to make sure that we, again, go back to the fundamental purpose of an IG program, which is to make us more competitive, to make us more profitable. Those ideas are hard to grasp, right, when you're trying to make money, because we know that sometimes when you're trying to make money, you don't always follow all the rules. And that's a human nature. That's a dynamic. Sometimes that's a competitive thing that just happens. But I think as IG practitioners are starting to see this fusion between, okay, the outcomes of a specific activity and how those outcomes need to influence behavior on the front line. So I guess it kind of ties to the last point, which is about communication. And a lot of times words don't cut the muster, right? Words, the English language is limited in when you try to communicate things, because like I said, information governance and data governance and information protection, well, they all have kind of, they all sound like they're similar, but well, maybe not. But if you really look at the fundamental tenets of what those practices are, they're all pretty much the same. But getting people to see that is very hard for the issues around territory that I mentioned. But I know we're 34 minutes left, Jen, so we should probably keep chopping.
Oh, I've got you on timer. Yeah, we're good. So the next group that we're going to talk about is around structure. So these would include these three top top 10 reasons, the information in the shadows, content fracturing, and reason number 9, sole custody of business data sits with IT. So those are 3 of these reasons in this bucket that IG projects fail. So Carolyn, where do you think we want to start here? What are some of the highlights and high points we want to cover here?
Well, so I have my talking points, but I'm gonna go off talking points. And I see this slide, and of course I've looked at it before, but I love the risk. If it exists, it's discoverable. And so I want to talk a little bit about that for a moment. As an ex-archivist, we used to say in the archives world, if you can't find it, it doesn't exist, right? Which is a sort of a different way of looking at it. But what we have here is a different sort of situation in which is particularly exacerbated by the fact that so many of us are now working from home, and that is that we have information and data all over the place, to the extent that some organizations don't even know what all of their systems are, and haven't brought the governance necessary to make sure that individual areas of the business have some control around whether or not they can procure a new system that's going to contain records, data, or information, along with the fact that there's a lot of when we say information in the shadows, we mean content that we don't even know is there. I worked for a client about, I guess it was 7 or 8 years ago on the West Coast. And I spent 6 months driving around and looking at paper records, of all things, that were stored throughout the West in big boxcars big railroad boxcars, which was a treat in the 110-degree summer heat, full of paper. They had no idea what was out there. And I'm guessing if we had time today to talk to our participants, that there would be some testimonials about other things that folks have seen, with regard to the organization not knowing what they have. So how do we get to resolving that? I see 2 key ways to help resolve that, and they are data mapping, which is all about knowing exactly what you have, at least in terms of content types, and so where it is, what it is, and who's responsible for it. And then to take that, so once you've got that information, you can act on it, and that's a whole other conversation in and of itself. But auto classification is, for me, takes data mapping a level deeper, and we can start to actually be looking at individual files and creating content profiles so that we have the comfort necessary to push the delete button. Sandy, I would love to hear from you about how you think auto classification is going to play a really important part of the data mapping and risk mitigation for content and records.
Sure, I think that in this we're almost sliding into the enablement section, so that's perfect. But up until relatively recently, the mechanisms for actually understanding what content is were severely limited. Either you relied on people, kind of old timers who'd been there forever, who just knew what everything was and where it was, or you relied on really simplistic, like, well, it's a PDF, so we'll just call it blah, or nobody's touched it in 8 years, so we'll just assume, anything that kind of ended with "we'll just assume" or "only so and so knows." That was the extent of it, and so no wonder people were reluctant to get rid of things. What we still see today, even though you gave an example of paper in boxcars, we are still fundamentally in the same position when the technique for managing content is just a simple time ticker. And I'm talking about the way most organizations manage email. They just say 90 days, 120 days, kill it, without any regard to what it actually is. And so what's happening is this sea change of, now that you can know what something is, that is the method that you should use for managing it. And that is what auto classification brings to the table. I sometimes make the metaphor, it's sort of like the equivalent of having x-rays or having blood testing, which if prior to that, you were basically just guessing, like what is, some person's in terrible pain. Well, I can't see them, I can't touch them, I can't talk to them. I don't know, put leeches on them and let's see if that works. Like, we have graduated past that. We have sophisticated medical technology to look inside them. We can figure out what's happening in their blood. We can touch them, talk to them, have their whole medical history brought up on screen. That is the same thing that auto classification brings to the table. It goes through the actual content of a document and can provide basically anything you could ever possibly want to know, so that you can manage it with intelligence instead of, blindly.
Yeah, so that's a good thank you, Sandy. That's a good segue into something else I was thinking about while I was listening to you speak, and that is, maybe some of you who are listening in on this are thinking, all right, well, yeah, okay, I can understand how a data map is really foundational for the organization, but I've brought this up before and I wasn't getting the buy-in that I needed. And so I think there are some new things that you can be saying to leadership and the people who allocate funds about the value of data mapping and the ease of data mapping. 10, even as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, it was tough to create a data map that wasn't obsolete the moment it was halfway finished, right? Let alone all the way finished. And so we spoke earlier about why I talk about this now. Well, here's one of the items, and that is that the technologies are finally maturing to the point that they can really start to do some of the things that we either haven't been able to do, or because of not having the tools at hand, maybe not being able to justify the budget for it. We now have technology enablement that means our data mapping activities can be continuous and they don't expire. And that for me is a really important selling point when you're trying to get leadership to buy in to whether or not they're going to be interested in acquiring a data mapping tool or making use of what they already have on hand to do that. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is, while on this slide is, I think, Eric, you spoke about this earlier, but that is how important it is to have the cross-functional representation into the decision-making of what goes on in information governance. Data mapping is a wonderful example of how a data map can allow you to identify redundant business processes and increase efficiency by eliminating that redundancy. It can help IT update and plan its roadmap, and we can also, of course, and then the sort of fundamental item here, being able to press the delete button on that stuff that's clogging up your systems. So that was it. And if we didn't really talk about sole custody of business data sitting with IT. I think a really good concrete example there is that I'd be curious. I wish we'd put a poll in this, because I would love to know how many of our participants have SharePoint sites in their environment that haven't been touched in over 2 years, and that's just representative of the amount of content that's being produced, but not necessarily being governed, and it has to do with the importance of why this needs to be addressed.
Think about the idea about content curation, and a lot of times IT will come to a legal or a compliance team and say, I just need the rules. Well, what if IT had a tool that would actually be able to inform the rules? Because what legal doesn't always know is they don't understand how many SharePoint sites haven't been accessed in 2 years, or how many SharePoint sites actually have PII. So there needs to be a middle path approach, kind of, and this is one of the points of these programs, is that it's more than working together. It's kind of choosing to pick certain metrics and measures that multiple teams can actually focus around. And sometimes it's like obligations or like managing your PII. Sometimes it might be making sure that there's not data exfiltration outside the organization. So you're looking at maybe, port analysis, and you're letting legal know that. So there's, I think, gone are the days where these IG teams will be led by one team, and we're really seeing more, more collaboration. But it comes at a heavy price when you have an inability. Well, I think first and foremost, like sometimes these programs are massive, right? You imagine doing this for like the second largest bank in the world, and the first comments that I got when we started doing mapping, for example, was, we have thousands of systems, many of which are not even owned or managed by us. And my response to that was, yeah, okay, well, that's fine, but just because you have thousands of systems doesn't mean that you don't have an obligation to respond if the CFPB comes knocking. And it got more people thinking about, the problem is very difficult, but you can no longer kind of accept it's too hard. It's too hard. Those days are gone, and the reason that are gone is because when you see interrogatories that are being published by SEC or Civil Division of DOJ, these regulators know their stuff. They years ago when I worked at the Bureau, not so much. Now they're sharp, and they're going to ask you questions that are very specific, and they will ask for policies and procedures. That's kind of also ran stuff, but they'll start asking you about maps and schemas and data flows and processes and stored procedures and stuff that maybe your map won't answer, but you need to think about ways in which you can develop the answers to those questions quickly. And an IG team can actually kind of bring that forward. There's one other thing here that I think is important, because Sandy and I kind of joke about this a lot. And it's like the idea of tech sweating. So when we walk into a company, a lot of times they'll say, well, you need the classification tool, and they'll say, well, what do we currently have that can do this? I mean, we work at UI, and when Carolyn and I help our IT teams, they'll say, I've got this storage management tool that could do that. And then when you start to get into it, you realize, not so much. And a lot of the defense that we have to bring forward isn't necessarily saying why your tools aren't going to be performant. It's more about why these other tools in the market will serve these other broader needs. So what we hear a lot of is, I've got this tool for the next 2 years. I really want to try to kind of sweat it out, and then maybe we'll think about IG tool, a classification tool later. Nope, wrong answer. A lot of companies need to hear the kind of value proposition and a business case to say, well, why would you want to use Valora over Varonis? Lots of good reasons, right? Now, I'm not picking on Varonis, but Varonis is an IT tool that's basically spawned out of DLP stuff, routines, and it's not a classification tool. It's not even an IG tool. And I'm not picking on Varonis. I'm just saying, when you hear from your IT teams, well, we have this tool, we can kind of maybe get some type of form and use out of it. No, fight back. I mean, and build business cases that are supported by metrics and real good requirements, so they don't have a defense. There's no defense for using a tool like that in the context of IG. But anyway.
Eric, just to pick up on that, there are a couple of other places where, I mean, as long as we're moving on to the tools slide, where the tools that might already be in hand really are a bad fit. You mentioned kind of DLP tools. Agree, don't really do the bulk of what we're talking about here. Similarly, some folks have e-discovery tools at their disposal, but e-discovery tools really don't go deep enough. E-discovery tools really are generally assume that there will be some quite sophisticated human beings looking at content down the line, typically attorneys, and after things have been culled way down, that is almost the opposite of the problem facing IG. There is no one or nothing. There's nothing culling that down to a manageable amount. It's the opposite. It's constantly growing every day. And the kind of signal to noise ratio is very, very different. It's likely that the newest stuff created in an IG world is actually valuable. Whereas in e-discovery space, you're trying to get down to that 1% of information that you're actually going to care about. IG, the ratio is going to probably be more like 30 to 50%. So it doesn't lend itself to extremely expensive, extremely qualified individuals sitting there analyzing, file by file. It would be an unbelievable expense. So using the e-discovery tool is the wrong setup. It's going to leave you, only a third of the way along, and all the sort of expensive, where you actually get the meat of anything, won't be doable. So it's sort of like the worst. It's sort of like building the foundation to a huge house and then realizing you can only afford a small house. Yeah. Right? That's where you're going to get stuck on that kind of tool. And then the last thing that I'll point out is specifically, around, I get this question a lot about what makes auto classification auto, because there are tools out there that technically do classification. And what they mean is they basically give you a menu that a human being could sit there and press tags on everything. Because the older style of doing this was to kind of come up with the policy and basically shove it down onto everybody's head. Every employee, your job is to figure out if it's a record. Your job is to tag your stuff. And you still see this today. You see it in email systems. You see it in DMSs, where it's on the individual to try and figure out what the thing is, what tags apply, and the classification tools just make the drop-down menus a little easier. Or they include something like same as last time. So of course, that's what everybody clicks. That is not auto classification. It's sort of manual classification, and it's going to be just a disaster because people will use any method in their smart human brain disposal to get around those systems, including doing nothing. And so what you wind up at the end, again, is this false sense of what everybody classified. No, they didn't. They pressed whatever buttons they had to press to get it out of their hair. That is almost the worst case scenario because you think that your world is in order and it's completely not. You're almost better off having not done that. So this is what we mean by rusty and inadequate tools, kind of jump naturally right to that middle one. True auto classification not only figures out what things actually are, but is performing it in an automated manner. That is, software, algorithms, machine learning are doing that work, not relying on a slew of individuals or the one individual who knows everything that ever was. I mean, talk about your single point of failure. So it's kind of putting the smarts into the system and letting the system run. So that's really what we mean by like rusty and inadequate tools. And by the way, I will just put this out there. Just because a tool was born recently does not mean it can still be quite inadequate. I'm going to not name names, but a lot of the kind of capabilities out there, particularly for a more M365 environment, aren't capable of enacting the kind of policies that are in place. They don't do a good job, for example, with event-based retention. They don't do a good job at managing content over time based on the actual, what we would call a document type. Not just it's a JPEG or it came from finance, but it is a cash flow statement from Q3 2014. Okay, that's the kind of level that we're talking about with true auto classification. So once you have those kind of levers, you can do, whether it's an e-discovery data pull or a DSAR for data privacy or for retention, you're kind of handling all of it similarly with a proper platform. So you do get some ROI, you get some bang for the buck, and you naturally are pulling these different groups in together to share in all the things we've been saying, share in the communication, share in the objectives, and of course, share in the budget. So instead of having 3 different tools, you have one tool. Mm-hmm. So this is really what a more modern IG platform looks like. It starts with auto classification at the center for sure, and pushes out into these other arenas.
Yeah, one other thing, Sandy. I mean, Jen, how are we doing on time? Because I want to
We're fine. Yeah.
One other thing, Sandy talks about, how some of these, tools aren't really kind of fit for purpose. And I look at like these tools that are being used in the context of discovery or DLP. And I see that there's issues around scale, right? And I think it's not just about analytics, but it's also about scale. So if you wanted to run a discovery tool around 100 gigs of data, you'd just really have a throughput issue, and it's usually firepower that you put at that volume, and that kind of determines how quickly the work gets done. But you're not dealing with 100 gigs of data. You're dealing with petabytes. Most companies are dealing with petabytes of data. So it's kind of like saying, you're gonna use a Cuisinart to kind of blend all the Cool Whip in your bathtub. I mean, it's just going to take forever to do that, and a lot of times the engine won't be sufficient enough to actually get things done. But just put technology aside for a second. So if you're thinking about the problem in your organization, and you're hearing things like, we have this other tool, you might want to be able to use that. Why don't you go investigate that? And you'll spend a lot of time and administrative, nonsense and headaches to kind of come to the point where you realize that it's okay, but it's not going to serve all your points. So think about when somebody asks you, well, why can't you use this DLP tool or discovery tool? Think about the approach around IG and the process, because the approach around discovery is get data, index it, full content index it, unless you're going to do some quick peek metadata analysis, but that's not the norm for discovery. It's do a full text, run a keyword search, and then filter it and then put it in a review platform. That's the discovery paradigm. DLP is expression-based, looking for stuff that's leaving the organization or following a path through the organization so you can put controls on it. IG is none of that. At least it's none of that right away. IG processes start with looking at things like, well, who owns this content? Who doesn't work here anymore? Is this content not supported? Is this a crawl word file that WordPerfect file that we don't even have that actual client anymore? Is this a file? Is this a data set that's part of a system that we don't back up anymore, or it's no longer in production? And then you can get into, so that's an approach. That's phase one of an approach, and there's lots of ideas there. Phase two is looking at maybe metadata analytics and thinking about content profiles around age content or file type content or lacks access. Again, none of that's full content. Full content is when you need to do auto classification based on some meaning-based routine, like it's a record in accounting that's part of a filing procedure. That's where auto classification can really, not auto classification can help you upstream too. But if you think about winnowing down data sets to begin with, and then applying these high-powered tools like Valora at those data sets, you're really kind of dealing more with the marrow of the important stuff, as opposed to dealing with all of it in the whole bathtub. You're not blending the whole bathtub. You're just going to work with the stuff that you've qualified through those different procedures and approaches. So think about arguments and metric-driven arguments that can help you get around the argument, well, we got to use that tool, or we own that thing, we're going to sweat it out. So anyway.
Jennifer, do we have time for me to add one more thought to that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so we spoke a little bit about IT being the sole custody of business data, and that's an issue. But the fact is that the IT is often the custodian of content, and there's certainly the custodians of a lot of assets as well as networks and software and that kind of thing. And so one of the things I think we really need to do is, even without whether or not you've got the organizational structure and the leadership buy-in that you need, is to strengthen the relationship between the folks who are core IG and records management with IT and the legal team, because we have chronically seen IT pushing forward with vision, which is a great thing, right? To from some in some ways to help the organization stay ahead of the game, if you will, with regard to technology. However, one of the things that we often see in IG and records management is that there wasn't a whole lot of thought given to what kind of impact that new tech is going to have on the day-to-day business processes of the organization. And for any of you that have recently undergone a migration to M365, or you're getting ready to undergo that, you understand how important it is to make sure that your processes work already, or at least work well enough to pick up and wholesale move to that new environment. And so I have just seen so many instances where we have a client buy a big new ERP or some other enterprise solution. M365 obviously is on everyone's mind these days, and this is a great way to go talk to for you IG practitioners on the call, to IT, and say, hey, we can help you make sure that the implementation of these systems goes smoothly by simplifying and cleaning up our processes prior to just saying, okay, everybody, this is how we're going to do it now.
Caroline, if I could just pick up on that. One of the things that we have started doing lately, and I recommend this to everybody on the call, is to actually, when you finally get the audience with IT, is actually show them what a records retention schedule looks like. It's amazing how many of them have, even though they're supposed to be living under one, have never seen one, and certainly never appreciated the nuances that are listed in there, that you need to know document type, that you might store something differently or for a different duration depending on certain circumstances, and then the whole concept of event-based triggers. Most IT people have had zero exposure to an RRS. So just, if you ever get that opportunity, just sit down and educate them, because that is in theory the policy that everyone in your organization is supposed to be living under. And here the stewards of content didn't even know anything about it.
Yeah.
So Jen, I see that a question has come in.
No, we were going to wait till the end.
Oh, I didn't know if we were at the end at 1:53.
Because we're right here at the end. So in conclusion, so any final thoughts on this? We do have one question. Ma, why don't we just ask it now, and then we'll get your final thoughts. So a question that was posed, I think everyone can see it actually. What progress have you observed with applying IG to documents, meeting recordings, etc., in Microsoft 365?
I would love to field that one. If I could.
You go first, and I'll back you up. I'll support you.
Sold. So the good news is that nearly everything in M365, including all the stuff in Teams, is underneath the hood, essentially basically in a SharePoint database. So as long as you have access through the Graph API, you're going to be able to get at that information. It's just a data blob inside SharePoint. So again, for sophisticated tools that can handle, if it's something that's in like a WAV file format, like a recording or what have you, but the documents that are stored under there as a database blob are not going to present any issue, as if they were, whether they're sitting in that or they were sitting on a file share, it's going to be basically the same to a crawling engine that's going to be able to crawl that database. I'm making some assumptions about the sophistication of technology. Obviously, I have fairly sophisticated technology available to us, but again, this is one of the things that Microsoft really got right, was making that Graph API, which is a centralized API for their whole M365 universe. So once you kind of master that, then you really do have access into these areas. That's for analysis. So the question becomes then, all right, once you know what's there and you've sort of applied these tags and stuff, now how do you manage it? That's where M365 is a little bit weaker. Eric, I'll let you speak to that side of it.
So there's a couple different I agree with what you said. I think the Graph API, although they're still in beta for the record, and by the way, they don't call it records anymore, it's just Microsoft Records Management, just for those of you who are wondering. And so the Graph API is still in beta for the records management capabilities. And so there's really two classification schemes that come forward in 365. There's this thing called MIP, Microsoft Information Protection. That's similar, analogous to DLP. And then there's MIG. And so what MIG is, it's a labeling and trainable classifier capability. Labels are really like user-assisted labels that you can place on a Word document or a set of documents and say, this is an accounting file. MIG enables you to not just apply labels, but also apply retention. That's good. And that's a great thing because you're dealing with data in place. The trainable classifiers and also the MIP, information protection, and MIG labeling, if it's not human assisted labels, it can be done through a machine learning process, which ends up at this point, based on the maturity of the technology, and this is not my opinion, this is publicly available, you can go Google this, tremendous amounts of recall, right? So you can look for, you can go through a nomenclature rubric and you can say, these are the specific naming characteristics of a file, go find it. And Microsoft will yield lots and lots of stuff. Tremendous recall, but it's not very precise. And because it's not very precise, you get into an over-retention process. And then the last thing I'll say is active plus is not possible, right? So that's what, when Sandy talks about event-driven retention, that's what that means. So when you see these retention schedules, you see ACT plus 6 years. We can't do that yet. So I would be, I mean, Susan, to your question, there is retention capabilities. I think in E5, I wouldn't think E3 is not really that great for retention capabilities. You can actually apply labels in E3. E5 is where retention labeling and trainable classifiers exist. Trainable classifiers are still very much in evolution. There's this whole Microsoft thing called Microsoft syntax. And that's where you can learn more about, trainable classifiers. But I would say be cautious and do POCs and run the labels and trainable classifiers so you can see for yourself what precision recall actually looks like.
I'll just add to that. This wasn't in her question, so I'm going beyond the scope of the question, but what is the cost in taking these different approaches? E5 has a lot of promises, and as Eric said, they're only sort of delivered. The cost for E5 for an organization is typically astronomical. And what we see now, obviously the world that Valora sees is the world that speaks to Valora, but what we see is more of a leaning towards E3 to get kind of the bulk of the capabilities for a much more palatable cost, and then layer on something like Valora that's doing the heavy lifting, getting a lot of what kind of the E5 promises without the E5 price tag, and a little bit more of a dedicated kind of purpose-driven software program.
Yeah, and so if you want to do a quick, you can look at pricing for E3, E5. I think it's between $15 and $18 per user per month in additional to go from E3 to E5. So your standard base price for E3. 15 to 18 bucks on top of that for E5. And if you have, and Microsoft's trying to get into hybrid licensing right now, but that's not quite what's happening. So you can do a quick, if I've got 1,000 users and I want to go 15 bucks up or 20 bucks up, I got to spend this much more money. And what would the cost of another tool be? That's a pretty simple, equation, but there's a lot of good data that Microsoft puts out there around pricing, but you got to think about the actual benefits, because what you're going to get might not be what's being advertised.
Good. Well, you know what? We're right up at the hour. So if there are any other questions, feel free to enter them there, or our contact information is here. So if you want to email any of us with some questions afterwards, that would be great too, and we'll get back to you there. But because we are on the hour, I want to thank everybody for attending today. It was a great discussion. Thank you to our panelists, Carolyn, Eric, and Sandy, for your insights. It was very educational. It was great. So again, I'll send out the link to this recording. I'll also send the link to the ebook and white paper if you haven't downloaded it yet. And I invite you to contact us, book a demo, check out the rest of our webinar series online, and we will see you next time. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.